Nau mai haere mai to our first episode of Branching Out, the podcast series where we discuss Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. And today we're welcoming Greg Steward. Tēnā koe, Greg. Thank you for joining us today. So you're an Indigenous forestry silvicultural scientist. You've been in this space working for more than 50 years and you're now an emeritus scion scientist. You've been a mentor to me, you've been a friend to me, you've taught me a lot. Out of anybody here at Scion, you've taught me the most about Indigenous forestry. And I sort of regard you as one of the godfathers of Indigenous forestry and Indigenous silviculture in New Zealand. Today we're going to be exploring your background and experience in this space. So can you please tell me a little bit about yourself?
Tēnā koe ki tā rangi. Those are very kind words, a little bit to live up to there. I guess going back to my past, I'm originally from South Auckland, a place called Manurewa. I grew up there as a kid with my family when Auckland was still, to some extent, parts of it were quite rural. And we spent a lot of time as family at local beaches at the Manukau or the Waitemata harbours. When I was at high school, at Manurewa High School, like a lot of kids going through 3rd, 4th, up to the 6th form, I was wondering what I was going to do. At 16 years of age, or even at 15 years of age when I started thinking about it, I stumbled across an advert from the New Zealand Forest Service for a trainee scheme, which was called the Woodsman's Training School scheme, based at Kaingaroa Forest here in the central North Island. Actually, it turned out to be a number of schools around the country. So I put in an application and was quite surprised in 1974 to find that, or to go into an interview with people in suits in a major office in central Auckland on Queen Street and be interviewed for that role, and then to be told before Christmas that, yes, I'd been accepted. And suddenly it dawned on me I'd be leaving home for the first time and living on my own and doing adult things when I probably still wasn't really an adult, a long way from being an adult, and moved to Kaingaroa Forest in January 1975, still as a 16-year-old.
Oh, so you're still a teenager working away from home. Was this a big step for you?
So that was quite a new step. So that was going from South Auckland to Kaingaroa, a little village out in the middle of nowhere, having lived in even smaller villages at Puriora and Minganui, doing some training around forestry, and mainly pine forestry, to come into a research organisation. And I got assigned to 4 sections over 12 months for 3 months in each section. The first one happened to be the Indigenous Forestry section.
Okay, so with that in mind, entering the Forest Service, what kinds of opportunities and experiences did you have to learn across different sections of the organisation?
At the time in late 1976, when I came into Aotearoa, we were still harvesting or clear felling native forest. So having been in the Indigenous section for 3 months, I then went into the establishment section and learnt a bit more about establishing pine forests and some of the new techniques that they were trialling, some of the new equipment. After that, I went into I think it was called the old economics. In those days, economics was about adding value to the trees, and that was the thinning and pruning and seeing what effects they had on the pine forest and the productivity and the wood quality. And after that, the final section I went to was the genetics or the tree improvement field, and spent 3 months there.
If you're thinking about today, in this day and age, I suppose, has your opinion changed? Or, what is an Indigenous forester and what does it involve?
It has changed, and it's changed quite a lot. As I say, driven mostly by government policy, and government policy is always driven by economics of the day and social mores, I think is the term that they use. So things have changed, and were changing quite rapidly. There was a very strong green movement across the country, which still exists and probably is even stronger than it used to be. In those days, we didn't tend to see much of the cultural component to it, and that was something that kind of went straight over the top of my head as a young person. So things certainly have changed. Indigenous forest silviculturalist is not about forest ecology or conservation. It's about managing trees or forests for a defined purpose, and usually that purpose would be economically driven. Initially, when I first started, that was a long way out into the future, but as time has gone by and we have more results from research and our own experiences, then we see those economic activities potentially coming in much sooner than what initially was thought was likely to happen.
During your career, what would be the greatest highlight or some of the great highlights for you?
There's not just one thing. It's around the places that I was able to go, places that I would not otherwise have gone to, places like Great Barrier Island, for instance, and spending time on there remeasuring old trials, but also the people that I've met and had a chance to engage with and spend time with. Some of those were folks here at Scion, some of the people who were my mentors and people who shared their background and their experiences to managing and directing Indigenous forestry. There's not just one thing, it's always an accumulation of things that suddenly you look back and go, yes, that's why I do it. Yes, I enjoy it, which is why I do it, but it's a summation of a whole lot of experiences and a whole lot of input into, and that's a never-ending process. I still do that today. I had the fortune to be with Ngāti Hine just a few weeks ago, and again, that's a learning process. So whilst I'd been asked to go up there to share my experiences, one of the things I learnt very quickly as a young trainee was you learnt the most when you kept your mouth shut, but your ears open. And I still do that when I go out because there's always something to learn, and not necessarily from the places or from the people that you think you're going to learn it from.
So I guess taking into consideration diverse worldviews has been quite illuminating for you in your career. When you say that you did your training and in the first quarter you were working in that Indigenous block, and after that you had establishment and economic growth and so on, what was it about the Indigenous forestry or that first quarter of your training that made you want to stick with Indigenous forestry as opposed to exotic? Why did it pique your interest?
I think after 2 years pruning and planting and harvesting and doing jobs, some jobs that you liked and some jobs that you didn't quite like so much, like lifting trees out at Kaingaroa Nursery in the middle of winter with bare hands and -3, -4 frosts and barely being able to feel your back or your fingers at the end of the day, running over to the tractor and trying to warm your hand on the exhaust pipe about every half an hour. Those sorts of jobs weren't very exciting. I did enjoy the research time that I did with the exotics within Scion when I was doing my training, but I guess it was the variety, and again it was often to do with the people who were part of the team that we were working with. So we often didn't do much with other folk, other landowners. At that stage we were obliged to work just on what was Crown land, most of which is now in the conservation estate. But we were spending time living in huts, getting to know each other, so every day was different. So if you worked in a pine forest, there's a little bit of sameness about it, depending on your role. If you're just doing supervising pruning gangs, then you're just running around looking at people cutting branches off, and you can do that all day, every day. It can get a little bit tedious. But for Indigenous forestry and for Indigenous forestry research, it was something very different almost every day. And that kind of keeps you going, keeps your interest going. There's nothing wrong with people who do pruning and who do supervising or do stuff in exotic forestry. If that's what they find is a great career for them, then go for it. Absolutely go for it. If you want a little bit of variety, then for me it was Indigenous forestry, and I found that really interesting.
Okay. Well, they do say that variety is the spice of life, and it sounds like that's what you've been keen to get in terms of your work experience and the people that you work with and the areas that you work in. So I'm kind of detecting a bit of a theme here. I guess for those that know you, they know you as somebody who's very passionate about Indigenous forestry and native trees. Can you share any personal or professional experiences that have reinforced your dedication to the field?
If I think back to, I guess, some of my family visits, particularly to Northland, and sitting in the back of a car, driving around looking for places to stay or looking for places to visit, it did strike me, even as a teenager, was you didn't really see much native forest. You tended to have to go and find it. Go to places like Waipua Forest to go and see Tāne Mahuta, go into Omahuta or Puketi, but you had to make specific visits to go and do things. So when I got into Indigenous forestry, I was going to those places to do work, and I was finding out how complex they were and how interesting they were. Initially, we were still doing tree felling, and as a 16 and 17, 18, 19-year-old, it's pretty exciting standing next to a 60-metre tall limu tree or kakatea or totara and hear it come crashing down and see the look on the faces of the people doing the felling and the harvesting, knowing that they were excited about their job. And many of those were Māori folk, because they were often working in their what would have been traditional iwi lands. They were Forest Service employees, and we were all part of a big family. And there was a very big family feel about a lot of the old government departments. So we kind of got into that role of looking at the forests and just sort of gaining experience, and people were teaching me about this tree or that tree and where I might find it and where I might see it. And I often still look back when somebody asks me about a specific species. Should I plant it here? Should I plant it there? And I just delve into my memory banks and go, where have I seen this? What do I think it's been doing there? How do I think it will go if somebody moves it to a different environment? And that kind of tests you on a daily basis. That tests your own experiences.
Yeah, I'm a little bit like you, where I think my favourite part of my work is generally the people that I work with and the bonds that I form with those people.
One of the great things about being in the middle of Indigenous forest, out in the native forest, you are and do feel like you're miles from anybody. And it was one of the things I really enjoyed. I spent a lot of time in kauri forests that were 4K walk in along an old forgotten track to find a trail, and would spend a day or two completely by myself trying to relocate old trails and having a thoroughly good time. Thoroughly enjoying myself, the peace and quiet, myself and whatever remaining birds there were in the forest, spending time.
Did you ever have anybody claiming that you were trespassing on their land? Has that ever happened?
No. So right through to the end of the Forest Service days, we were working only on what was then termed Crown land. What's now conservation, still Crown land largely, but a lot of shared management coming in with local iwi. But when we started working on private land, there was always a relationship developed. And that was kind of, I guess, new for scion and forestry research. Usually at that stage, people were felling forests and then they were replanting forests on the same sites. So those relationships were always in place. When we were looking for new trial sites with private landowners where they were looking for converting from one land use to another, then obviously the most important thing was the development of a relationship. What were they expecting? What could we do in research that they would find acceptable? And particularly after the likes of Cyclone Bula on the East Coast, when there was an awful disruption to what was business as usual for farmers. So access to farms was being lost, was going to be expensive to replace. So regrowth of manuka and kānuka, gorse, all those sorts of things, losing grazing. How were families going to make money to keep themselves and to not put the land at risk again, their ownership at risk again? They were really interesting. And that came about through one of my old bosses. His wife is Maniapoto, and so obviously their children are Maniapoto as well. So he had that cultural aspect that to self and others, who mainly English, Irish, European background, we didn't have those links or those relationships or that kind of understanding. Whilst we'd lived and worked amongst Māori for a lot of our careers, that component of it had never really surfaced. We were a Crown entity working on what was Crown land following Crown policy. So now we were in a whole new paradigm. And they were really interesting conversations that we would have over quite lengthy periods of time. But if that's what we wanted to do, then if we wanted to partner, that's what the process was. We were all, I guess, learning about each other and what we might expect. Some of those friendships, some of those relationships did develop into friendships, and there were invitations down and stay at places and go and visit very remote areas and be part of the whānau for a while. And it was always, I guess, a test to know that whether you'd been doing the job properly or not.
You've talked about some good experiences and some highlights in your career. Are there any, I guess, lowlights or hard times that you've had in your career?
Working in Indigenous forestry is quite different, either research or the product or the industry side of it has always been hard. It's followed pretty much a roller coaster ride of, was it policy that this government or the next government would support or continue with, or were there other economic drivers to be followed and that Indigenous forestry wasn't a high priority? So finding funding for Indigenous forestry has always been hard. Always, always. And that's largely, I think, because of the time frame since Indigenous forestry was a mainstream activity to now the knowledge base and the experience has been lost. So those people who you talk to about the potential, those forestry people you talked about their potential for Indigenous species, an Indigenous species or a Indigenous forest system, if you ask them about the economic opportunities, do they see it? Then they don't, because a lot of them have been, I guess you'd say, radiata pine for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and they don't know or haven't been taught anything else that might be an alternative. And sometimes you might even say that's the same for alternative exotic species as well. When the industry is dominated by 90% or more by one species, it's very hard to get people to look outside. So we often talk about thinking outside the box. That's a big statement out there. But often when we go into discussions about thinking outside the box, we often end up just reinforcing the box, in my experience. So trying to get people to think that perhaps native species aren't slow growing and can be productive and may be useful for people who want to do something other than radiata pine or who want to move away from radiata pine, particularly mana whenua, then finding folks who can back up their aspirations is really difficult for them. So that usually ends up, in my experiences, I've always found Māori to be very entrepreneurial in their thinking. But because of sometimes the lack of information on which to base good decisions, they often tend to be conservative. If you've just got your land back or if you just received a compensation from the Crown, the last thing you want to do is to waste it again. So people are often going back to pine, which to me is a okay option initially, but in the long term, what do you really want to do and how you're going to get. So lack of funding has always hampered Indigenous forestry research, and it's been a big disappointment because forestry, I think New Zealand has forgotten, or the industry certainly has forgotten, that that's where forestry started. It didn't start with exotic species, it started with native species. Whether that was trying to build homes, clearing land for settlements and for food production, and then Europeans, settlers started coming in and speeding up that process. A lot of that knowledge and experience behind all that is gone. There's very few people now that you can tap into, say, what do you think about this species? What do you think about that species? Can I plant it there? Can I plant it somewhere else? You can either be disappointed and spend your life being disappointed and frustrated, or you can just try and make the best of what you've got and just get some information, because that's what people are dying for, is information.
Well, I suppose that's part of what this podcast series is trying to tackle, to illuminate on some of the challenges in Indigenous forestry, some of the barriers, some of the upsides, and I guess the potential.
So when I first started with Indigenous forestry research, the expectation seemed to be that we would recreate the forests that had been cut down. The idea of intensification and management hadn't quite been thought through to a logical conclusion, I don't think. So when we were replanting after selection logging or after clear felling, replanting with native species, we're planting at very high altitudes with lots of competition from native regrowth, but the ability and the funding to do the maintenance for those plantings to get them through was always lacking. So there's lots and tens of thousands, if not millions of native seedlings were planted around the countryside. So when I started, we were talking in terms of rotation lengths of maybe 250 years. That's okay if you're a multi-generational landowner. You can contemplate those sorts of things, but an industry is not going to. Now, there's no way that they're going to do that when they see their bread and butter at 25-year rotations or short. So when we started doing more intensified research around Indigenous plantations, as opposed to Indigenous restoration type plantings, we started to find that actually the rotation lengths might be around 120 years, because we were looking at heartwood development. So we'd gone from thinking about restoring forests, a big podocarp forest or a big kauri forest or beech forest, cutting that down and then replanting and expecting to go through another long cycle and recreating all the ecosystems and all the values and what have you. We started to think about, well, what type of wood is going to come out of these forests? Is it going to be like pine? If you grow it fast, or the faster you grow pine, the wood quality generally tends to deteriorate. So we started looking at heartwood development, because heartwood was a big part of large native trees, so big kauri and big podocarps, the emu, totara, kakatea, all had large volumes of naturally durable heartwood. So we looked at the development of that, and we thought, well, actually, we can go maybe think about rotations of 120 years, because there seem to be some signs of good wood quality within a lot younger trees. But 120 years is still a long time. It's still multi-generation. Then we started to think about, well, okay, so exotic forests are largely or all based on sapwood. In actual fact, having heartwood creates problems in pine forest, because you've got to separate out the different wood characteristics to go to different end uses or what that can be used for. So we looked at very young trees and found that the sapwood contained, for both kauri and totara, properties that actually resembled old growth trees of many hundreds of years of age. And I thought, hang on a minute, we've gone from 250 to 120, and now we might be going to 80, or maybe even younger, which was where we started with some of the species like Douglas fir, for instance, another exotic conifers. And like most of the conifers, exotic species, when we planted them, we didn't necessarily know what the first rotation length was going to be. The Douglas fir was around 60 to 80 years. But with intensified research, we went to, I think the rotations now are 40, 45 years, possibly, maybe even sooner. So we were starting to apply the same thinking to the Indigenous species as we were to the exotic species. And then the opportunity to do some growth modelling on faster growing young trees. We found with the kauri growth model, for instance, that kauri and plantations on good quality sites, well managed, had growth productivity that was between 12 and 20 times more productive than in natural stands. And then suddenly we were talking industry numbers that they were getting interested in, or they could get interested in, because it gave them numbers that they were familiar with. So in terms of cubic metres per hectare per year, in terms of productivity and rotation length in terms of return on investment. So those sorts of things we changed our thinking. But we've got to get that thinking now out into the rest of the industry and out into society. Because I think at the moment what holds Indigenous forestry back largely is the social psychology and the paradigms around natives are slow, are difficult to raise and to grow, and will always be that way. But that is not necessarily true.
So I guess especially with the length of rotations with some of our species like Pinus radiata, Douglas fir, that have been shortened, you think that in this day and age we sort of have better information, better biotechnologies, and I guess just better breeding information all round to maybe put that same kind of effort into our natives and to have them be just as valuable, if not more valuable than some of these really popular exotics.
Mm.
It's sort of a matter of investing into our natives, just like we did with those exotics.
That's right.
So it's a pretty simple answer, really, to explore, the economic or not, the non-economic value of looking into shorter rotations, of looking into breeding and of changing those social paradigms and those ideas.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, food for thought, hey. So anyway, Greg, thank you so much for coming in and joining us. Thank you for sharing your whakaaro, your thoughts. And thank you to this week's listeners for tuning into our first episode of Branching Out, the podcast series where we discuss Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry. Join us next time. Mauri ora.